it is good to be with you all if we haven't had the chance to meet yet. My name is John. I have the privilege of being one of the pastors here. And hey, Connor, congrats on your wedding, by the way. Connor got married a few weeks ago. Very excited. Sorry, let's just squirrel. Anyway, my name's John. I'm one of the pastors here, and I actually want to start with a little bit of a confession for you all, and my confession is this. I excel at several things in life, at least two things, but one of the things I definitely do not excel at is any type of video or computer game. I am truly awful. Anyone else? Here's the thing. I really believe if they were to do a world ranking of everyone in the world, I would be bottom 5. I am like the Chicago Bears of playing. Listen, I'm lovable, but I barely ever win. But just because I'm not very good at them doesn't mean that I didn't play my fair share of games growing up. I know for me as a child of the late 90s, early 2000s, I'm legally obligated to tell you that one of my favorite games was in fact Mario Kart. Shout out to Double Dash on the GameCube. Some of y'all have no idea what that is, and you missed out. That's what we call a double portion, a double blessing right there. I also went through phases with games like Guitar Hero or Rock Band. Anyone play those? Great family game. I also think this gave an entire generation their education in classic rock. The only classic rock I know is from Guitar Hero. I also think that between the ages of 12 and 14 for me, the only exercise I ever got was by playing Dance Dance Revolution. Listen, y'all, I could, a little bit of, some of y'all don't know what it is. I got down on that pad, I really did. But by far for me, actually, my all-time favorite game growing up was a little-known game called Crash Bandicoot. Anyone? Yes. Some people have played Crash before. Oh, this is really good. So if you haven't played it before, Crash Bandicoot is like an off-brand Sonic the Hedgehog. And it's a pretty straightforward game where you are this mutant marsupial bandicoot named Crash, and you have to guide him through different obstacles to collect different tokens on different levels. It's pretty straightforward. And one of the main things that you run into while playing Crash Bandicoot are these boxes or these crates. And what you do is you jump on them or you spin into them in order to collect what is inside. And one of the reasons that the game is pretty simple is because, as you can see, pretty much all of the crates that you're going to run into are very clearly labeled with what is inside of them. And so you playing the game, you know to jump on the crate that has Crash's face, which will give you an extra life. And you also know I should probably avoid, the TNT box, the Nitro box. Pretty simple. Now here's where the game gets complicated. Every now and then, you're just a little mutant bandicoot running along, and you run into a crate that looks like this. It has a question mark on it. And so you don't know if when you jump on that crate, if it's going to give you an extra life, or if you are going to be exploded by a secret TNT crate. And the reason that I bring this up is because I actually think this is a perfect picture for what it is like to be human and to be in relationship with other humans. Because I don't know about you, but the people I'm in relationship with don't come with clearly marked labels of what is inside of them. Like when you sit down to interview someone for a job, they don't show up wearing a t-shirt that says, "I'm a gossip and I'm slightly manipulative." When you go on a first date with someone, they don't sit down at the table with a tattoo on their forehead that says toxic narcissist. People don't come with clearly marked labels of what's inside of them. You actually have to bump into them in order to find out. But today, and over the course of the next couple weeks, I don't just primarily want to focus on other people, because if you and I were to be really honest, sometimes those question marks can exist on our own minds and hearts as well, can't they? I think that's kind of what it means to be human. And in this series that we're calling The Toxicity in Me, over these next few weeks, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be getting real honest about the reality that there are, in fact, toxic, even dangerous personality traits that exist within each and every one of us. And what it means to be human is that sometimes those traits that are within the crate of our own soul, we actually can be completely unaware that they are there until someone bumps into them. And all of a sudden, the situation gets blown up. A couple thousand years ago, Jesus said it like this. He said, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye?" Over the next few weeks, you and I are going to be doing a little plank maintenance together. We're going to be asking the question, really humbly, where is there toxicity in me? Where do these traits actually exist within the box of my own soul? And how do I actually invite God into those things to ultimately transform them, not just for my good, but also for the good of others? That's where we're headed over the next couple of weeks. And today we're going to start by diving in to a teaching from Jesus that can be found in Matthew chapter 5. So if you want to reach under the seat in front of you, go ahead, grab a Soul City Bible, open it to page 786. If you're worshiping with us online, welcome. We're really, really glad that you're here. You can open up your own Bible, Matthew chapter 5, open up a tab. The specific passage that we're going to look at, it takes place within what scholars would call the Sermon on the Mount. And this is, you may have heard of it before, it is perhaps the most famous sermon that Jesus ever gave. And within it, he gives this teaching we're going to look at. And I want you to know right up top, this is a teaching that for a long time, not only did I not understand it, but in fact, it was frightening to me. And maybe even I was offended by it. Aren't you excited to dive into it today? Here we go, Matthew chapter 5. We're going to start in verse 21. It says this is Jesus speaking to a crowd of people. He says, "You have heard it said to the people long ago in the law, you've heard it said, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you, anyone that is what? Anyone who is angry at a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, raka, which was basically an expletive in Jesus' language, raka is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell." This morning, as we kick off this series, I want to spend a few moments together talking about toxic anger. This past year, the American Psychological Association published a study claiming that 23% of working employees said that anger was a problem in their workplace. Some of you are raising your internal hands right now. I see heads nodding. Hopefully you didn't come to church with your boss today. And you should also know that that number was actually significantly higher when those subjects were asked about repressed or unexpressed anger in their workplace. Elsewhere in the study, it said that 30% of adults have at one time or continue to seek professional help for their struggles with anger, whether it's through a support group, through therapy, something else. I found another study this week that said that 66% of all automobile accidents are caused by aggressive driving due to road rage. Strangely enough, 97% of all road rage in the world occurs right here in Chicago on I-90. That last one was I was the only subject in that study. It was just me, by me, for me. But I looked around, if you can't tell. I looked around quite a bit this week, actually, and I did some research about where our world is at in terms of anger. And the more I looked, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought about you, and the more I thought about me, the more I realized I actually don't think you need all of these stats to show you just how present and prevalent anger is in our world. Because all I would need to have you do right now is just open up your phone and go on Instagram. Just start scrolling for about 0.3 seconds. All we need to do is just put the news up here. All we got to do is turn on some political talk radio. And I guarantee you, you will not only hear anger, but eventually you are going to start feeling angry about all of the anger that you are hearing. Because if we're really honest with ourselves, those stats, they're not just about somebody else. Those other angry people over there. But those stats are actually about you and I. In some ways, we are included in that. Each and every person in this room does or has or will experience anger. Do you want to know how I know that? Because you're a human being. And you're a human being living in today's world. And that's why I think it's really important for just a few minutes for us to dive into this strange teaching from Jesus to help us begin to discover what can we actually do when anger starts to rise up in you. Not if, but when. And before we really dive into it, I want you to know that a very popular interpretation of that teaching from Jesus that I just read, a really popular interpretation of that text is that as a Christian, as someone who's in a relationship with Jesus, you shouldn't get angry. I kid you not, there's a lot of sermons out there, there's a lot of Christian teaching out there that would say that if you are in a relationship with Jesus, what you should do with your anger is ignore it. You should repress it. You should control it as much as you possibly can. And if you're a real, true believer, one day your anger will magically disappear, and then you will be nothing but a joyful, smiling robot angel for the rest of your life. I kid you not, that is actually historically, throughout church history, a very popular interpretation of that text. And I want you to know that that reading of that text makes me so angry. Because here's the problem with it. The problem and the reason that I don't think that Jesus is saying that anger or being angry is a sin or wrong or bad is because do you want to know what happens in other sections of the Bible? Jesus gets angry. There are plenty of passages that you can find in the Old Testament where God experiences feelings of anger. And I think one thing we can actually learn from passages like that is that anger is not an inherently sinful, bad, toxic, even dangerous emotion. But there are actually things that it is appropriate for us to be angry about. There are circumstances in this world, racism, gun violence, poverty, abuse, war, where anger is actually an appropriate response. You should be concerned if you're not angry about those things. And so I don't think that what Jesus is talking about here is that righteous kind of anger. In fact, I know that's not what he's talking about. Jesus is not even talking about that like gut reaction feeling of anger. But in order for us to understand what Jesus is talking about, we have to dig into the language a little bit. So I hope you brought your Bible nerd glasses because we're talking about the Greek. So for those of you who don't know, this section of the Bible, most of the New Testament, in fact, was originally written in the Greek language. And in Greek, they have several different words for our one English word of anger. For example, one of the Greek words for anger is the word thumos. Everyone say thumos. Thumos refers to that gut reaction type of anger, like a quick flare-up anger, like you're cut off in traffic anger. For me, it's when my dog eats food off of the counter for the third time today, that quick flare-up type anger. This is anger that we feel and experience all the time as humans. You've probably felt this today. We can't necessarily control when it pops up for us, and usually, because it's normally over something small, it usually subsides almost as quickly as it pops up. That's not the kind of anger that Jesus is warning against in this passage, because the Greek word that Jesus uses for anger here is the word orgizomai. Everyone say orgizomai. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, John, that sounds a little bit more intense. And that's because it is. See, orgizomai actually describes a type of anger where we remain angry, or where we get stuck in our anger. Another way of maybe translating this text would be Jesus, when he says, whoever is angry, what he's really saying is, whoever is nursing a grudge against somebody else, or whoever finds themselves in a fixed state of anger that they are struggling to get out of. What this text is saying, like we said before, it's not that anger is inherently bad or negative or toxic or even sinful. But what Jesus is saying here is that there is a type of anger that is toxic for our souls. And that type of anger that is dangerous for us is when we stew in our anger. When we choose to marinate in it and turn it over, what happens is it grows, and eventually it's not just anger, it's resentment. Eventually, it's not just anger anymore, it's bitterness. Eventually, it's not just a flare-up anger, it's outright hatred of another person. I think what Jesus is really talking about here is he's talking about the coworker or the boss in your office who behaves in such a way that makes you angry, or maybe even treats you in a way that makes you angry. But because you don't want to have a difficult conversation with that person, or maybe because you fear the repercussions of such a conversation, you just keep all that anger buried down. And so day after day, meeting after meeting, they keep showing up and they're bringing that stinky food in the fridge. And then all of a sudden things that didn't make you angry start making you angry about that person. Why do they wear that? Why do they pop their gum in the meeting like that? And it grows and grows and grows to the point where you wouldn't just say that you dislike working with that person, but in your truest heart of hearts, you would actually say you now hate them as a person. I think what Jesus is talking about here is a brokenness and a bitterness that exists in our families sometimes. I don't know if your family's like this, but for me, I'm talking about the type of brokenness that can actually be traced all the way back to a single argument that was had years ago over who brought what side dish to Thanksgiving. And even though that argument happened years ago, because the anger from that single argument over something silly was never actually dealt with and never worked through, it just grew and grew, holiday after holiday, and now there are two people in your family who will not even speak to one another all over a casserole. But it feels like so much more than that now because they've sat in it, they've stewed in it. What this text is teaching is that the danger of anger, listen to me, the danger of anger is not in feeling angry. The danger of anger is choosing to remain in that anger. It's choosing to sit in it until you feel suffocated by it, until you feel buried by it, until you begin to see everything in your life or everything in the relationship through the lens of anger. And that is why Jesus offers us a different way when it comes to the anger that we feel. You'll notice that we actually stopped reading in verse 22, but that's not the end of the teaching. Jesus, he finishes that portion of the teaching with something pretty intense that I want to point out. He says, anyone who says you fool, anyone who gets stuck in anger like that and holds that grudge, they will be in danger of the fire of hell. Now that can be really, really scary anytime the H word comes up in church. And so I just want to do a quick side note here. What Jesus is actually talking about here, if you again look at the original language and look at the area in which Jesus lived, he's not really talking about like an eternal afterlife of damnation here. He's actually talking about a hell of your own making. Saying that the experience of that relationship, if you hold on to that resentment for so long, that relationship is going to feel like hell to you. If you hold on to that bitterness at your office, going to work, it's going to feel like you work for the devil. Some of you wanted to say amen there. I get it. Not because I feel like I work for the devil. I love my bosses. Love them. But Jesus actually goes on in this teaching in verse 23, so let's read it. He says this, he says, therefore, if you are offering a gift at the altar, Jesus is giving an example here. If you're offering a gift at the altar and there you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled to them, then come back and offer your gift. He gives another example in verse 25. He says, settle matters quickly with your adversary, your enemy who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still together on the way. Save the judge some time. Or your adversary may hand you over to the judge will hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Now, Jesus is making a lot of ancient cultural references and allusions here for his original audience. But here's the thing that I want you and I to focus on. The really important thing I want you to pull here. In both of Jesus' examples, in the example of going to the altar, in the example of going to court, did you notice that there is an immediacy with which Jesus encourages his audience to engage with their anger? Did you notice it? He says, hey, if there's relational brokenness between you and another person, before you go do your religious thing, before you go to church and make yourself right with God, actually go and make yourself right with that other person first if you can. Deal with that. He's saying, hey, if you have an argument with somebody, why don't you try and work out that argument while you're still on the way to court? What Jesus is saying here is not that we shouldn't be angry. What Jesus is saying, when you get angry, do everything within your power in that moment to investigate that anger. To to begin to ask questions of that anger, to begin to engage with it, to have a conversation. Jesus is saying when anger pops up in your life, start to walk through and work through that anger, because if you don't, that anger will start to work its way through you. This is actually the heart of this teaching. This is actually the heart of what Jesus is talking about. Because I don't know if you know this, but here's how anger works. How many of you have one of these? It's a credit card. Anyone in the room? Credit card? There's nothing wrong with that. Here we go. So I know there's a lot of different, philosophies on personal finance and budgeting and all of that. Not everyone is a fan of credit cards. But one thing that I think is actually quite beautiful about a credit card is, say I want to buy something, like something nice, something real nice. I want to buy myself something on a Monday, but I'm not going to have the money to pay for it until Tuesday. With a credit card, I can buy that thing on a Monday, and I can pay for it on Tuesday. Beautiful. And anyone who has a credit card will tell you that a credit card works best for you when you do what at the end of every month? When you pay it off completely. Now here's where a credit card can get dangerous. This is a free personal finance lesson. You didn't even know you were going to get this when you showed up to church today. A credit card can get dangerous, and why some people don't like them is because when I buy something on Monday and then I don't pay it off on Tuesday, now, not only do I still owe the money from the thing that I bought on Monday, but what does the credit card company charge you? Interest. And that's the thing about anger. Anger charges interest on your soul. When we feel angry and we refuse to deal with it, we refuse to pay it off, we try and ignore it, we try and pretend it's not there, or we let that one little bit of anger grow and lead to more destructive kinds of anger. Even if you just leave that anger sitting there, it's going to grow. It is going to charge your soul interest. It will grow and grow and grow until you find yourself drowning in an insurmountable pile of emotional debt. You'll feel lost. You'll feel controlled by it. You'll feel directed by it. And here's the thing, you can try and keep that down as much as possible, and anyone who has ever been in serious credit card debt will tell you that eventually your soul is going to come to collect. Eventually your humanness is going to catch up with you, and that anger that you've been trying to ignore, it will blow up. And when it does, it might just blow up your life. And that is why Jesus invites us into a radically different way of living, where anytime anger pops up in our lives, right then, right there, we don't just move on. We don't just go to the next thing. We don't just press it down. We don't allow ourselves to express it in negative, unhealthy ways. But as soon as anger pops up, we engage with it. We investigate it. We ask, where did that feeling come from? What does that tell me about myself and this relationship? We have a conversation about it. We begin to work through that anger before that anger starts to work its way through you. And here's the best thing. Here's actually the secret gift of anger that I didn't realize before. Do you know what happens in your life when you choose to investigate your anger rather than ignore it? You grow as a person. When you actually ask the hard questions of where did that come from? What was that argument actually about? You start to learn about yourself and about how you see the world. Do you know what happens when instead of choosing to stew in anger in a relationship, you actually choose to work through your anger in a relationship? Anyone who's been married longer than 10 minutes will tell you that the relationship actually grows stronger on the other end of it. Rather than growing more distant, you actually grow closer and more intimate. Rather than stewing in your anger with growing distrust, you actually have more trust after you work through it. You work through it before it works its way through you. Because here's the secret about anger. Anger, while it is not bad, it is not good. Anger is simply an invitation to deeper transformation. The reality is, each and every person in this room, including myself, you're gonna get angry. Some of you have already gotten angry today. Some of you are angry right now because you got a brunch reservation and this is going long. Every single one of us is gonna get angry. We already know that. Here's what you might not know. The anger that you feel, it is going to transform you one way or another. How your anger transforms you, that is up to our response to it. And when we choose to just ignore the anger, or when we choose to sit in it and turn over in our heads why we're so right, and why the other person is so wrong. When we sit in it, through that process, we are being transformed into a more bitter, more angry, more frustrated, more hostile person. Your anger transforms you in that way. But as we said, if we engage and live the way that Jesus invites us to live, and when anger pops up, we instead ask a question: where did that come from? What was that about? When anger pops up in a relationship and we just say, hey, can we talk this through actually? What's really going on here? Where did that come from? When we begin to work through it, through that process, you are being transformed into a more grace-filled, more self-aware, more patient, more kind, more trusting person. Anger is always an invitation to deeper transformation. How we're transformed depends on your response. I'll tell you what, in my marriage to my wife, Erin, there are 3 letters that are guaranteed to make me angry. The letters are D-I-Y. Now, Erin loves a good project around the house, and another confession for you all, I am not a handy guy, okay? I work with this, I don't work with these. And I'll tell you what, early on in our marriage, when Erin would have the simplest DIY project for me, I would get so angry. Not that she wanted the project done, but through the process of putting up a simple gallery wall, I can't even hang a picture frame, y'all. I would get so angry. And I remember it was in our first apartment here in Chicago in Lincoln Park, and I was hanging this lighting fixture in our bedroom, just getting mad, getting angrier, trying to keep it down. And eventually, Erin remembers this, I threw the drill on the ground, and I just screamed, I don't know why something that is so easy for so many people is so difficult for me. And just like you just got scared, she also got scared. And eventually I got the light fixture kind of up. It never fell, so. Thank you. But later on, I'm talking with Erin and I apologize to her. I say, hey, I'm really sorry that I kind of blew up like that and I lost my temper. I'm so sorry. And as we continued the conversation and I continued to reflect on that moment, what became clear for me, and I shared it with her, I said, hey, I think what I was really feeling wasn't actually anger. It just came out as anger. What I was actually feeling was embarrassed, because I wasn't able to do this thing that in my mind a good husband should be able to do. And so I was embarrassed. And as I sat with a little more, I realized, and actually underneath that embarrassment were feelings of shame. Because I'm not handy, I have this narrative in my head that because I don't know how to work with tools, that makes me less of a man. And so my pride was hurt. And then when I really dug down deep, I realized that under that embarrassment and under that shame, there was actually some sadness there, because usually a young man will learn how to do these things from his dad. And I love my dad. He's done his best, but he never really taught me how to do those things. And with how our relationship is today, I don't feel comfortable to just call him up and ask, like, hey, can you help me hang a light fixture? And so there was actually sadness underneath. All of that was underneath it. It just came out as anger. But through that process, I started to learn about myself. I started to learn about my self-limiting beliefs and my insecurities and some opportunities for me to begin to change narratives in my family of origin, all through just engaging with throwing a drill over a light fixture. And listen, my real confession to you is that I do not do this every single time I get angry. Erin will tell you how often I get angry in our marriage, and my tendency is to think that I can just keep it all down. And she'll tell you how often it comes out as me being passive-aggressive. That's what it is for me often. I don't do this perfectly, but I don't want to be the type of person who is controlled by anger. But I actually want to be the type of person who invites God to use even my anger as a tool for transformation. For me, for my relationships, for others. And so for you, I just wonder if this week, there is some anger that you've been feeling. Maybe it popped up for you recently. Maybe it's something that you've actually been sitting with for a while. And you're feeling it start to transform into bitterness. You're feeling it start to transform into resentment against a friend or a coworker or your mom or your spouse or a sibling. And I just wonder if this week we could all make an agreement to simply accept Jesus' invitation that when that anger pops up, we investigate it. And a really, I think, useful tool that has helped me a lot is a tool that we actually use here on staff at Soul City. It's called the clearing model. And that's just language, code word for have a conversation about it. And this is especially helpful when in relationship with someone, anger pops up and something happens that makes you angry. And the only guideline, it's really simple. The only guideline is this. When anger pops up between you and someone else, within 24 hours, you go to that person and you say, hey, can I clear something with you? And if you don't like that language, you can just say, hey, can we talk through something? Can we talk through what happened yesterday? Can we talk through what happened earlier today? And you share how it made you feel. Maybe you need to apologize. Maybe they need to apologize to you. You just have a simple conversation. You begin to work through that anger before the anger starts to work its way through you. And you don't have to just do this with another person. You can actually clear things with yourself. You can do it by setting aside time to journal within 24 hours or taking it to God in prayer. However, whatever your kind of model is for engaging with your anger, can we agree, Soul City, to be the type of people who are not driven by anger, who are not controlled by anger, but instead the minute that anger pops up, we actually say, oh, God's actually invited me to learn here. Oh, God is actually inviting me to grow here. God's giving me an opportunity to become more of who He created me to be. Can we agree to be those types of people this week?